Da, 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 da. All right. Okay. How you doing? So there's a fairly famous YouTuber out there that's spread all over the internet, influencing quite a bit of politics from Canada, named Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain Radio, right? And I think I've had about enough of his bullshit, right? And so I decided, because he's all about the arguments, right, and talking about facts and this and that I would jump in with a fairly long, complicated read and critique and theory. And Okay, so this might take just a little bit of time, and I'm going to let you guys know a couple things. First of all, right, the real critique is his ongoing perpetuation about IQ, right? IQ, intelligence quotients, and the perpetuation of what it may mean, how it is it's defined, what it is it may mean, and this binary, genetic insistence versus cultural overlay in terms of how it's defined, right? So, and once again, I apologize if this seems long and meticulous. I might be a little bit capricious. I'm a little zigzaggy. I'm a little bit all over the map. In this case, I want to stick to the topic the very best that I can, and hopefully I won't run off, right? So Stefan, you're all about facts. You want critiques. Let's go into things first of all, right? Let us find out what Stefan generally has to say about IQ. First of all, okay, let's see. So let's hear what he has to say right here. Let's turn that up.
They can't do it any more than Detroit can do it. Any more than sub-Saharan Africa can do it. Any more than the indigenous aboriginals or the pygmies in the Amazon rainforest can do it, because they don't have the intellectual horsepower on average to defer gratification and achieve freedom. So even people raised in the relative freedoms of the West who have an IQ average of 85 can't reliably as a community achieve those freedoms. So we know why. It's IQ and ideology.
Okay, so right here he says, we know why. So we know why, right? It's IQ and it's ideology, right? His two main sticking points, right? After he went from his book on, ethics and whatnot, now he's migrating and he's really, really harping on these differences. And, so this is his shtick. It's his gig, right? So we know why he says, right? Then let's go ahead and we'll skip a little bit ahead here. And this is on his "You Want People to Die" video, right? So let's just kind of go here.
Selling a shitload of weaponry to despotic governments. They fucked up Africa. And they, the political elites, the leaders, the people who profited from it, they should be the ones to pay. It was wrong to steal from people in the West and dump massive amounts of free stuff into Africa. You have an
Okay, once again, he's anti-welfare also in almost every capacity, right? He's got this property, my property, discrete outlines of what my property is. But that's another tangent, and we'll go into.
IQ 70 to 85 population, they're just going to have lots of kids. High IQ populations restrain their breeding where there are excess resources. Low IQ populations breed to carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is unsustainable. It's literally like feeding, this is a silly analogy, but it's like feeding your garden, seeding it with like incredible food for rabbits until there are thousands of rabbits and then cutting the food off. That's just sadistic, you understand? Oh, look at the rabbits starve, look at the rabbits fight. Are you crazy? This is evil. It's so wrong. It's unholy. It's satanic. It's demonic.
Yes,
so I care now. I have my life to live. I have my value.
Okay, so anyway, with that video, I'm just gonna, you should listen to those two things. And don't get me wrong, like, I think that Stefan is an interesting character in that I like to go along with a lot of his arguments here, and then some of his arguments here, but then where he reduces things back to this IQ, it's very, very, it's very, very annoying. So IQ to me is like when Stefan says this.
It wouldn't make any sense because they'd say, well, there are no physics in dreams. That's kind of one of the ways you know that they're dreams rather than waking reality, because
right, there are no physics in dreams. Right now, it's kind of interesting that there are no physics in dreams, but there's statistics about a singular unifying one-axis number that amounts to human mental capability, and that's what the general intelligence is about. That's what is the definition of G, right? Okay, and so we have that. Now let's go here, right? Okay, so here he's going to start with this bit again, and then we'll jump around this video, right? These are just starting points. So.
Now another argument, and this guy is not saying that this doesn't exist at all, but the other argument, the one that I am leaning towards, says, well, there are IQ differences between the genders, there are IQ differences between racial groups, and that explains the differences between outcomes in these genders and races and ethnicities. And that's a testable hypothesis. It's highly testable. Because what you do is you say, well...
Okay, so first of all, he's leaning towards it, right? So he leans toward it, and then he says it's highly testable, right? So even in his words, there is a bit of doubt. And he does make a video like, hey, these are my opinions, right? But the way he harps on IQ is problematic because, as you'll see...
Okay, so let's say blacks in sub-Saharan Africa, IQ average 70, right? 2 standard deviations below Caucasians in Europe and other places. That's a big, terrifying difference. A while ago, 70 was considered mentally retarded, and so it's a big challenge. So what you would do is you would say, I don't know, you could take someone in the middle, right? So blacks in America have an average IQ of 85, right? 20% miscegenation, 20% European. So what you would do is if we can't talk about any of the...
Well, see, in just that, right? The idea of a 15-point difference, the fact that he's going to say, well, these are what the averages are, and we can Google this and find out what this is. This isn't a critique of IQ as of yet from me. I'm just priming my video here, right? So okay, let's get to the next part.
Disparities between, he focuses on men and women, doesn't mention IQ, but if we can't focus on any of the differences, then we can't solve the problem, right? So this guy's an engineer. I don't want to speak for him, but as an engineer, what he wants to do is he says, well, let's put prejudice aside, let's put bias aside, let's put what we would like to be true aside, and let's deal with what is actually going on in the world. Let's deal with the facts and build a case from the ground up. Because the hypothesis that all group differences arise from bigotry is just a hypothesis, right?
Okay, so the hypothesis that all group differences arise from bigotry is just a hypothesis, which then, right, comes down to, well, isn't the idea of G itself just a hypothesis? I believe so. I believe it is still within that range, but that's what the reading and that's what this video is all about. It's an argument. Since he likes arguments, let's go on and give him a nice, long, dilated argument here.
Okay. This goes all the way back to the bell curve. Many men in the 90s, right? Charles Murray and Richard Hernstein wrote The Bell Curve, which if you haven't read it, I don't care what you have to say on this topic because you're just woefully uninformed. You're like somebody in the 17th century who never read Copernicus or Galileo, or Tycho Brahe, or any of those guys. So East Asian, Caucasian.
Okay, so we're just going to back this up. We're just going to play that one more time for everybody listening, right? Because he's getting his notions of IQ from the book The Bell Curve.
Ashkenazi Jew territory, and it doesn't take long to figure out. This goes all the way back to the bell curve. Many men in the 90s, right? Charles Murray and Richard Hernstein wrote The Bell Curve, which if you haven't read it, I don't care what you have to say on this topic because you're just woefully uninformed. You're like somebody in the 17th century who never read Copernicus or Galileo, or Tycho Brahe.
Okay, right. So once again, everything's back to the bell curve. And so we will find out even what the authors of the bell curve have to say about their own work in the bell curve later on in the video here. Let me get to this little 2-minute point. Let me speed it up a tad, so try to follow along.
No cultural differences across any Caucasian. It's ridiculous. Anyway, so this should be a welcome entree into the conversation about diversity. In other words, if you have a monomania of political opinions, you're only allowed one political opinion, which is that all differences in groups result from bigotry. No other data, no other facts, no other arguments, no other perspectives, no other measurements, no other, like the IQ is like, as far as psychology goes, there's a lot that's kind of woo-woo and loosey-goosey, but my understanding is that as far as like IQ, that's the one thing, or what's called G, general intelligence, that's like the one thing that is fairly indisputable when it comes to psychology, that it is significantly, if not largely genetic, that it's highly predictive of life outcomes, that nobody knows how to alter it in any fundamental or permanent way. I've heard some exceptions. If you don't spank, you get a couple of IQ points on your kids. If you breastfeed for recommended at least sort of 12 to 18 months, you get another couple of IQ points. But outside of that, nobody knows how to change IQ in any permanent way, and IQ gaps between men and women and between ethnicities.
Wait, look, I'm just going to say, notice once again how he caveats his own language here a tad. I'm just going to kind of back this up, speed through it again, not to reiterate it, but let me see if I can stop on one of the points.
Diversity. In other words, if you have a monomania of political opinions, you're only allowed one political opinion, which is that all differences in groups result from bigotry. No other data, no other facts, no other arguments, no other perspectives.
Okay, so I'm going to be proposing another argument altogether, and I tell you, I've read the bell curve. I've read The Mismeasure of Man. I've listened to people talk about all sorts of things, facts, and figures on IQ, and I have my own particular theory, and I'll run over that at the end.
No other measurements, no other, like the IQ is like, as far as psychology goes, there's a lot that's kind of woo-woo and loosey-goosey.
Okay, so IQ, as far as psychology goes, it's woo-woo and it's loosey-goosey. Okay, so as far as psychology goes, right? So and what Murray and Hernstein bring up is metatricians, right? They're the guys that are reading the metrics, and they call it psychometrician. Anyway.
But my understanding is that as far as like,
okay, my understanding as far as
IQ, that's the one thing, or what's called
that's the one thing.
G, general intelligence. That's like the one thing that is fairly indisputable.
That is fairly indisputable. So okay, so anyway, so he's got this kind of loosey-goosey, own self caveating, like he's kind of getting in, but I think Stefan will realize that he himself is he is loosey-goosey. But then when it comes down to stating his opinion about intelligence, he tries to land it down like, hey, this is the way it is, right? And I played that earlier. These are the cases.
When it comes to psychology, that it is significantly, if not largely genetic, that it's highly predictive.
Okay, so now once again he's bringing up psychology. So first it was psychology is loosey-goosey. Now he's saying in psychology
that nobody knows how to alter it in any fundamental or permanent way. I've heard some exceptions. If you don't spank, you get a couple of IQ points on your kids.
Okay, so nobody really knows how to alter it in any permanent way. Like, so increasing in intelligence, consistency towards orientation towards problems and problem solving doesn't possibly increase it. This has nothing to do with my theory. This is just, I'm just trying to show the generalization of how Stefan keeps harping on intelligence based on the bell curve.
If you breastfeed for recommended at least sort of 12 to 18 months, you get a couple of IQ points. But outside of that, nope.
So outside of that, if you don't hit your kids, you get a couple points. If you breastfeed, you get a couple points. Outside of that, nobody knows, right? There's no, I've seen him interview a couple people about IQ that I think favored his opinion and so forth. And I've argued with some people, some psychometricians online on Facebook about IQ, using some of what I learned prior to my coming up with my own theory.
But to change IQ in any permanent way, and IQ gaps between men and women and between ethnicities are substantial, and at least up to now cannot be remediated by any known approach or technology. So,
okay, and they cannot be remediated, right? Okay, so IQ cannot be remediated by any technology or anything. Okay, so he's stating his case, right? He asserts these as facts. He believes he's, you know, like, so I've interviewed these people. I know the facts. And if you haven't read the bell curve, I'm not even going to talk to you. You don't even know what you're talking about.
These are facts. I mean, after the bell curve came out, the American Psychological Association, I think it was, put together a whole task force and went through all the data, and they were like, "Yep, no, he's right. This is like, we don't know much, but we know this one for sure." And so it's just a fact.
Right? We put it all together. We don't know much, but we know this one for sure. And that one is that IQ. Yep, we know that for sure. Okay. Interesting, though, that he would say that based on the bell curve.
If you can't bring facts into a discussion without being attacked and ostracized and stigmatized and fired and threatened, right? If you bring facts into a discussion and you are attacked, you're not dealing with anything rational. You're dealing with something specifically anti-rational at this.
Okay, so that's my starting point. That's my primer for this little video, right? Is that he's going to say these are the facts, these are the case, and then he's going to say, you know, if you can't bring in these other facts, right? So then you're irrational. So let us then begin the preface to the well, let's back up just a tad. We're gonna go over, and I apologize. This is the reading part. This is where I will be reading a little bit, and we're gonna start out with the mismeasure of man. Now, first of all, if you read, well, hang on one second. Let me not do that. Okay. What I want to do first is read from the bell curve, and it's from these are my own notes, so I don't have the page numbers on them, but these are in the introduction of the bell curve. Right? You can read the bell curve in a cursory sort of way, and they even encourage you to do so. And they said, well, there's several different ways to read our book. Okay. Okay, so anyway, and so this is how they sum the mismeasure of man, Stephen Jay Gould's book. And first of all, before I go into this, Stephen Jay Gould wrote this book apparently in 1981, right? Then the bell curve came out in 1990, and then this is their critique. This is their critique, almost in whole, of the mismeasure of man. Right, this multi-volume paleontologist out of Harvard, also because the bell curve authors, or one of them is from Harvard, the other one from MIT. This is a Harvard PhD professor in paleontology that was studying this. And so anyway, here's the point, though. This is what they say, and so after this book was written, in, I think it was 2002 or 2006, but after 1990, and he had a chance to add an appendix of sorts to his book about the bell curve, right? So a lot of people, if you argue, oh, well, the mismeasure of man kind of defunct that. Yeah, but ask them, you know, Stefan, hey, have you ever read the mismeasure of man? First of all, do you have any discontents whatsoever about the bell curve? And do you have any compliments about the book you probably haven't read, The Mismeasure of Man? There, I'll ask you that. Okay, so this is what the bell curve says. In 1981, Harvard paleobiologist Stephen Jay Gould authored several popular books on biology, published The Mismeasure of Man. Gould examined the history of intelligence testing, found that it was peopled, racist, and self-deluded fools, concluded that deterministic arguments for ranking people according to a single scale of intelligence, no matter how numerically sophisticated, have recorded little more than social prejudice. The Mismeasure of Man became a bestseller and won the National Book Critics Circle Award. Intelligence is a bankrupt concept, whatever it might mean. And so now they're quoting him, right, from the book. Intelligence is a bankrupt concept, whatever it might mean, and nobody really knows even how to define intelligence. Intelligence is so ephemeral that no one can measure it accurately. IQ tests are, of course, culturally biased, and so are all the other aptitude tests, such as the SAT. right? So before I continue with this started the left's argument about to what extent is there a cultural bias. Okay, so back to the bell curve's summation here. To the extent that IQ tests such as IQ and SAT measure anything, it certainly is not an innate intelligence. IQ scores are not constant. They often change significantly over an individual's lifespan. The scores of entire populations can be expected to change over time. Look at the Jews, who early in the 20th century scored below average on IQ scores and now score well above the average. Furthermore, the tests are nearly useless tools, as confirmed by the well-documented fact that such tests do not predict anything except success in school. Earnings, occupation, productivity, all the important measures of success are unrelated to the test scores. All the tests really accomplish is to label youngsters, stigmatize the ones who do not do well, and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that injures socioeconomically disadvantaged in general and blacks in particular, right? And okay, so let's see. And I'm gonna jump in here and mention, right? I went to school with a guy who scored very low as a child on his aptitude tests, right? On everything. And I scored fairly high on aptitude tests. I won't call them IQ tests, but they're more like aptitude tests, right? And I'll go into a little bit of that also, which is kind of a funny thing, right? But anyway, so and he's I think the guy is brilliant. He runs routers and networks and got a degree in mathematics. And there's even a TED Talk recently that says intelligence tests are not a measure of success per se. They're grit. Having grit and perseverance are more measures of success than this notion of these evaluative G measures of this IQ. So anyway, the public controversy had resurfaced some genuine issues, and the competing parties set about trying to resolve them. Bell curve, people talking about the bell curve. So right, the public controversy had resurfaced some genuine issues, and competing parties set about trying to resolve them. Controversial hypotheses were put to the test. Sometimes they were confirmed, sometimes rejected. Right? Okay, so right there, the authors of the book say, yes, there are competing hypotheses. Some of them work, some of them don't. Some of them are accepted, some of them aren't, right? Even that shows a variability, right? Which is different than the idea of G or IQ being a unity, right? And it's important to speak that these guys that write the bell curve are about unity. So, and they go here, often they led to new questions, right? So the fact that some of these controversial things, some were rejected, some were accepted, they led to new questions, which were then explored. Substantial progress was made. Many of the issues that created such a public furor in the 1970s were resolved, and the study of cognitive abilities went on to explore new areas. Okay. So anyway, with that, we're going to back up a little bit. We're going to read from the Measure of Man, and some of the quotes that I like in the epilogue. Okay, the New Republic article and so this is Stephen Jay Gould. The New Republic article among the experts is by now beyond much technical dispute that there is such a thing as the general factor of cognitive ability on which human beings differ, and that this general factor is measured reasonably well by a variety of standardized tests, best of all by IQ tests designed for that purpose. It represents extraordinary obfuscation achieved by defining experts as that group of metaphysicians working in the tradition of G and its avatar IQ. I hate the fact that I have a hard time pronouncing that. Anyway, the author even admitted on page 14 to 19 right? So this is, once again, that's referring to the bell curve, page 1419. The three major schools of psychometric interpretation now contend, and that only one supports their view of G and the IQ, the classicist, as championed in the bell curve, intelligence as structure, right? So that's what. See, this is what's problematic. Okay, so another version is the revisionists, intelligence as information processing, and then the radicals, the theory of multiple intelligences, right? And we'll cycle back to that. Okay, so Thurston placed the axis near the most widely separated of attributes among the tests, thus giving rise to the theory of multiple intelligences: verbal, mathematical, spatial, etc., with no overarching G. View in Hernstein and Murray's classification has been supported by many prominent psychometricians, including J.P. Guilford in the 1950s and most prominently today by Howard Gardner. In this perspective, G cannot have inherent reality, for G emerges in one form of mathematical representation for correlations amongst tests and disappears, or at least greatly attenuates, in other forms that are entirely equivalent in amounts of information explained. In any case, one can't grasp the issue at all without a clear exposition of factor analysis. And the bell curve cops out completely on this central concept. Okay, so let's see. Okay, now Hernstein and Murray actually admit as much in one crucial passage on page 117. So he's basically saying, like Gould is saying, look, these authors are going to admit this, right, on this crucial passage on page 117, that they hide this pattern. They write, it is almost always explains less than 20% of the variance, to use the statistician's term, usually less than 10%, and often less than 5%. What does this mean in English is that you cannot predict what a given person will do from his IQ score. On the other hand, despite the low association at the individual level, large differences in social behavior, separate groups of people, when the groups differ intellectually on average, despite this disclaimer, their remarkable next sentence makes a strong causal claim. We will argue that intelligence itself, not just its correlation with socioeconomic status, is responsible for these group differences. But a few % of statistical determination is not equivalent to causal explanation, and correlation does not imply cause in any case, even when correlations are strong, as in the powerful, perfect, positive correlation between my advancing age and the rise of the national debt. Okay, my charge of disingenuousness, I think we're back to Gould speaking here because he was quoting them. My charge back to disingenuous receives its strongest affirmation in the sentence tucked away on the first page of the Appendix 4, page 593, where the author states, in the text, we do not refer to the usual measure of goodness of fit for multiple regressions, R2, but they are presented here for a cross-sectional analysis. Okay, and then, so Gould says, now why would they exclude this from the text? To the appendix, that very few people will read or even consult a number that, by their own admission, is the usual measure of goodness and fit, right? Because that's what IQ is supposed to be measuring overall, this idea, this prognostication of what success is, what fitness is, this idea of what imaginably a human believes a good life is, right? And it was so interesting also because, and now I'm just going to kind of jump off on a slight tangent. Somebody was arguing, right? I was listening to these people, very, wealthy people that say, hey, I'm no smarter than anybody else, blah, blah, blah. I just do this. And they say, my idea of success is not so much about money. Like, money's great, but it's about fulfillment, right? Fulfillment. And so the concept of fulfillment itself, I thought was very, very interesting, right? Because in the appendix, as Gould is pointing out, they're saying the usual measure of goodness and fit, right? Okay, so Herstien and Murray's correlation coefficients, and correlation coefficient is something that you can look up and Google it, right, are generally low enough by themselves to inspire lack of confidence. Correlation coefficients measure the strength of linear relationships between variables. Positive values run from 0.0 for no relationship to 1.0 for perfect linear relationship, right? And so generally you run what is it? A -1 to a 1, right? And the 0 is no relationship. But okay, anyway, but and you can look up, you can Google, correlation coefficients, right? I'm just going to read this. So, although low figures are not atypical in social sciences for large surveys involving many variables, most of Hernstein and Murray's correlations are very weak, often in the 0.2 to 0.4 range. Now, 0.4 may sound respectably strong, and now we come to the key point. R2 is the square of the correlation coefficient, and the square of the number between 0 and 1 is less than the number itself. So a 0.4 correlation yields R squared of only 0.16 in the appendix, appendix 4. Then we discover that the vast majority of measures for R2 exclude from the main body of the text have values less than 0.1. These very low values of R2 expose the true weakness in any meaningful vernacular sense of nearly all relationships that form the heat of the bell curve. The heart of the bell curve, right? But the bell curve can scarcely be called an academic treatise in social theory and population genetics. The book is a manifesto of conservative ideology, and its sorry and biased treatment of data records the primary purpose above all. And this is what Stefan Molyneux is. He's an advocate for the right. He's not an advocate for the facts per se, right? Or you could read these factual treatments, these other opinions, right? Anyway, so an advocacy above all. The text evokes a dreary and scary drumbeat of claims associated with conservative think tanks, reduction or elimination of welfare. Another hot topic. Go figure, right? Because when you, I won't go into it yet, but right, even I won't go into it yet. Okay. I just hope I remember to go into it. However, if Hernstein and Murray are wrong about IQ as a mutable thing in the head, with humans graded in a single scale of general capacity, leaving large numbers of a custodial incompetence at the bottom, then the mode I that generates that gloomy vision collapses. And the wonderful variousness of human abilities, properly nurtured, reemerges, right? And then he says this: I closed chapter 7 in the mismeasure of man on the unreality of G, and the fallacy of regarding intelligence as a single innate thing in the head rather than a rough vernacular term for a wondrous panoply of largely independent abilities. With a marvelous quote from John Stuart Mill's, well worth repeating to debunk this generation's recycling of biological determinism for the genetics of intelligence. He has always been strong to believe that whatever received a name must be an entity or being, having an independent existence of its own. And if no real entity answering to the name can be found, men did not, for that reason, suppose that none existed, but imagined that was something particularly abstruse and mysterious. How strange that we would let a single false number divide us, when evolution has united all people in the recency of our common ancestry, thus undergirding with a shared humanity that infinite variety which custom can never stale. e pluribus unum. Okay, so once again, that's a John Stuart Mill quote that he's using here. The general amount of intelligence in each person must be measurable as a single number, usually called IQ. A linear ranking of people by IQ must therefore establish a hierarchy of differential intelligences. And finally, for the social factor in the argument, people's achievements in life and their social ranks in hierarchies of worth and wealth, correlated with their IQ scores. To characterize each of the four arguments in a word or two, human intelligence must be abstractable as a single number, rankable, highly inheritable, and effectively immutable. If any of these assumptions fail, the entire argument and associated political agenda goes belly up. I love that. I love that. I absolutely love that. Right. So that's not the entire. I'm going to continue on, but I love the fact that he, Gould is really stating this, right? Because G is a unifying singular score of human measurement, right? It's very problematic. Now, Binet, for the history of Binet, you can read the history of Binet, because Binet, he's the guy that started the IQ test. And if you read The Mismeasure of Man, Gould's analysis is, and maybe I have those in my notes here, but this is what I remember, right? Is that Binet developed IQ for school children, not to find deficits in students, not to find positive factors, right, in intelligence, but deficits, things of learning. So anyway, so Gould goes on here. Binet wrote, it is really too easy to discover signs of backwardness in an individual when one is forewarned. This would be to operate as a graphologist did, whom, when Dreyfus was believed to be guilty, discovered in his handwriting signs of a traitor or a spy, right? So I really like that also, because what it's suggesting to me, Binet is writing this, right? Almost that within somebody's handwriting, right? If one is this way, within their own handwriting, one could determine whether or not they were a traitor or a spy, right? Or has the handwriting has a sign of a traitor or of a spy, right? So, and then he says, okay, so anyway, he goes, Binet avoided any claim about inborn biological limits because he knew that innatists' interpretation, which the test scores didn't warrant in any case, would perversely destroy his aim of helping children with educational problems. And that was his point, right? To help the kids that had educational problems. Okay, so Binet, it is in this practical sense, the only one accessible to us, that we say that intelligence of these children has been increased. We have increased what constitutes the intelligence of a pupil, capacity to learn and assimilate instruction. Right? How tragic and how ironic. If IQ tests, and now we're back to Gould, how tragic and how ironic. If tests had been consistently used as Binet intended, their results would have been entirely beneficent in this sense, as I stated. I do not oppose mental testing on principle, but only certain versions and philosophies. But the very innatist and anti-Murielists spin that Binet had foreseen and decried did become the dominant interpretation, and Binet's intentions were overturned and inverted. And that's when they started trying to test the notion of positive plus IQs, and it was no longer about finding people's educational deficits. Okay, so anyway, we continue on. Metaphorical expression did often proceed into a literal construction, but was fraudulent. How dangerous it is in sensible things to use metaphorical expressions unto people, and what absurd conceits they will swallow in their literals. The quotation comes from a chapter in the 1646 work of Sir Thomas Browne. Pseudodoxia, etymological, or inquiries into very many received tenets, the commonly presumed truths. Leonas, included, another person, Leonis included a more overtly racist label in his last line of description for each variety. Here he tries to epitomize supposed behavior in a single word following the statement. Regitur means ruled. For the American, constitutedin, by habit is what that means. For the European, ritubus, by custom. For the Asian, opinionibus, or by belief. And for the African, trio, by caprice, right? So ruled for the American, or by habit for the American, by custom for the European, by belief for the Asian, and by caprice for the African. Surely regulation by established and considered custom beats the unthinking rule of habit or disbelief. All these are superior to caprice, thus leading to the implied and conventional racist ranking of Europeans first, Asians and Americans in the middle, and Africans at the bottom, right? Which is different than, Stefan says, oh, Eastern Oriental Asians are the highest, and then Caucasians, and then blacks, right? Which, what about Jews? What about Latinos? What about Native or East Indians? What about the darker? There's all sorts of new, haploid groupings all over the planet. They could be discussed in these, and perhaps people are still using the classical model of G and reiterating it despite all this. Okay, so anyway, now we're going to move on to the actual quotes from the bell curve, from the preface of the bell curve, right? They are the caveats. These are the authors themselves giving caveats to their own work, let alone having Gould criticize them, right? So in the preface, we are not indifferent to the ways in which this book, wrongly construed, might do harm. Hey, Stefan, maybe you're the asshole doing harm, by the way, right? Maybe all you guys are the ones that are misconstruing this and doing the harm, by the ways. So right out of the gate, that's their preface, right? Or within the preface. We have worried about them from the day we set to work, but there can be no real progress in solving America's social problems when they are misperceived as they are today. What good can come of understanding a relationship of intelligence to social structure and public policy? Little good can come of it, right? So even the authors, right? It sounds to me, right? My take, right, is that they're trying to figure out what's going on with society and the general idea, like language, philosophy. There's the idea of structuralism in language, structuralism in society, deconstructuralism within language, the idea of deconstructing a society, right? E pluribus unum, as for many as for one, the idea of united we stand, divided we fall, different, these different kind of cliche things, just to bounce around. Okay, so anyway, and then in their introduction, they go here. The French psychologist, and this is their take on Binet, right? A French psychologist, Alfred Binet, soon developed questions that attempted to measure intelligence by measuring a person's ability to reason, draw analogies, and identify patterns. These tests, crude as they were by modern standards, met the key criterion that Galton's tests, and you can look up Galton, that Galton's tests could not. Their results generally accorded with common understandings of high and low intelligence. So even right there, right, and that was my criticism before. If you read Gould and you read some of Binet's papers, Binet is focusing on deficits. He's trying to find out people that basically have learning disabilities. But out of the gate, and the reason I pinch this out is because the bell curve guys are saying Binet's tests go beyond Galton's tests because the common understanding of high and low intelligence, right, not and a deficit, which is really, so that's my criticism out of the gate of even these authors here. Okay, and so then they're quoting Spearman. Spearman's methods of analysis uncovered evidence for a unitary mental factor, which he named G for general intelligence. The evidence for a general factor in intelligence was persuasive by circumstantial based on statistical analysis rather than direct observation. For was and remains arguable. Okay, now I'm just going to quote this again, right? This is the fact. Since Stefan is all about the facts and he wants to know the facts, and he says, if you haven't read Murray and Herstein's book, The Bell Curve, you just know you don't get it, right? You're stupid, and you like somebody from the century that doesn't know comparing. Okay, so here they are once again, and look, they're talking, right? They're talking about G. They're talking about the guy that came up with it, Spearman, his method to uncover evidence for a unitary mental factor, right? Which is the classicist factor, right? One of three that are purported here, right? One of three, right? That they even mention, right? But by the end of this quote from the bell curve itself in the introduction, and I'll cut and paste this in the comments, or hopefully I'll get a bunch of it in. Spearman's method of analysis uncovered evidence for the unitary mental factor, which he named G for general intelligence. The evidence for a general factor in intelligence was persuasive by circumstantial, I don't know why it says circumstantial, but circumstances based on statistical analysis rather than direct observation. Its reality, therefore, was and remains arguable. Stefan, because he's going to tell you the facts. I'm Stefan. Let me tell you the facts. And here it is in their own book. G remains arguable. Spearman then made another major contribution to the study of intelligence by defining what this mysterious G represented. He hypothesized that G is a general capacity for inferring and implying relationships drawn from experience. I have this ability to infer and draw some relationships from my experience. There's some relationship. I can infer and draw some what a general concept. Even these authors are very general. They're very woo-woo, right? And they're talking about this is their goddamn introduction in their own book. Spearman's view, but it was not the only thing in itself. Spearmanian intelligence was a measure of a person's capacity for complex mental work. And then they're quoting him. By 1908, a concept of mental level, later called mental age, had been developed, followed in a few years by a slightly more sophisticated concept, the intelligence quotient. At first, was just a way of expressing a person, usually a child's, mental level relative to his or her contemporaries. Later, as the uses of testing spread, IQ became a more general way to express a person's intellectual performance relative to a given population, right? So now we're talking about the averaging relative, coffee break. Hang on, don't want to lose my spot here. Right. Okay. Anyway, at this point, the term got broadened. Right. So the concept of G survived embedded in an increasingly complex theory of structure and cognitive abilities. The first wave of public controversy, imagine there's public controversy, occurred during the first decades of the century, when a few testing enthusiasts proposed using the results as a mental test to support outrageous racial policies. Sterilization laws were passed in 16 American states between 1907 and 1917, with the elimination of mental retardation being one of the prime targets of public policy. Once again, this is a quote from the Bell Curve, 1920s. This first is based on the work done by Ellis Island by H.H. Goddard, who explicitly pre-selected the samples for evidence of low intelligence. So this guy Goddard specifically pre-selected the evidence for what low intelligence. His purpose was to test his test's usefulness in screening feeble-mindedness. So like Binet, even this guy was just looking for feeble-mindedness, but not in populations, but in individuals, and did not draw any conclusions about the general distribution of intelligence in immigrant groups, right? So this guy's not even averaging it, and yet they're implementing it, right? Showing these guys are even mentioning the problems. Like they said, the fear of the misuse of this, right? There was plenty to criticize in the psychometrician's results. The methods for collecting and analyzing quantitative psychological data were still new, and some basic inferential mistakes were made. Really, go figure. If the tests had been fatally flawed or merely uninformative, they would have vanished. Psychometricians of the 1930s had debated whether intelligence is almost entirely produced by genes or whether the environment also plays a role. By the 1960s and 70s, the point of contention had shifted dramatically. It had somehow become controversial to complain or to claim, especially in public, that genes had any effect at all on intelligence. Ironically, the evidence for genetic factors in intelligence had greatly strengthened during the very period of time when the terms of the debate were moving in the other direction. Okay, so my listening to these guys talk about it, right? So supposing that there you uphold one of the three theories on G, right? And you so like the authors, you choose the unifying one, right? The structural one called the classics, right? The classics, the revisionists, and the radical are the ones that they're saying, and we'll go over that. But suppose that, and then you have to suppose that there is in fact a unity, right? Instead of a plurality, that there is a unity. Somebody, right? The idea then, right? So they're saying, assuming all of that, there is a bit of irony that like some people, that the politics at the time said, hey, it's all cultural, right? But these guys are saying, look, we can still claim that there's genetics, right? Because they start finding family resemblance. Okay, so and then they're back to in the 1981 Harvard paleobiologist Stephen Jay Gould authored, and then went over that, which you guys can rewind if you want to hear that again. Okay, and then they're criticizing that. So, okay, once again, we have the classicists, the revisionists, and the radicals. The classicists, intelligence as structure, right? The classicists, intelligence as structure. Now, this is the one that the bell curve authors appeal to. And the revisionists called intelligence as information processing, right? And so here's a little write-up about information processing. Of course, Sternberg writes, a tester can always average over multiple scores, but are such averages revealing, or do they camouflage more than they reveal? Right? So the authors are right, or the authors are quoting Sternberg, right? If a person is a wonderful visualizer but can barely compose a sentence, and another person can write glowing prose but cannot begin to visualize the simplest of spatial images, what do you really learn about these two people if they are reported to have the same IQ? So the revisionist has a notion of information processing. They've already divvied it away from a unification, right? Because they're showing like, okay, well, we can at least measure these two, right? Okay. Then we're going to move on to the radicals. I'll be reading out of the bell curve itself, right? Before I go, okay, so here we go. The radicals, the theory of multiple intelligence and the absence of G, right? Okay, before I read that, though, I'm going to play from another guy, right, who's talking about these other sort of collective, what do you call them? Collective scoring techniques. He's a YouTube guy. He's a white nationalist. I respect him in the same manner that I respect Stefan, provided I didn't close that page down. Where'd you go, buddy? Where'd you go? Okay, and then, okay, so here he is, and this is Eric Orwell, and he's got the normie question. And this video is very interesting, right? Because he, well, I'll start it. Hang on.
Person can do. I don't consider myself incredibly intelligent. I know that I'm more intelligent than the average person. According to the ASVAB, which is not necessarily an IQ test, but it's usually used in that capacity, I'm around 143, which is roughly 3 standard deviations above the mean, meaning I'm approximately 1 in 1,000. And there are people much more intelligent than me. There are people who score 180, 190. So the difference between me and the average person, between me and the people who are scoring the highest.
Okay, now the interesting thing, and the reason I bring and play his video right now, is because if you look up the ABAB tests, let's see, where do I have so many links open? Right. The whole idea of where'd you go? Where'd you go? ABAB tests and the official site for. Come on. Sorry about the delay, folks. Let me just see if I can find it here now. That's not where. Oh boy. Oh boy. Okay, it's got to be on the same page. Anyway, while I am attempting to find that. Oh, okay. So the ASVAB is a multitude aptitude battery that measures developmental abilities and helps predict future academic and occupational success in the military. That's what it is, right? For future academic, proper, and occupational success, right? Once again, so a lot of these tests, I want to focus this, right? A lot of these tests are built around academia itself. For all the criticism the right gives about academia and these things, a lot of this has to do with future academic performance and then occupational success, and in this case, for the military, right? And the reason I'm bringing it up now is because this is a modern averaging. Like he says in the video, it's not an IQ test, but it's used from it. So what's stemming from the radical points of view are now academics, psychometricians, metricians that are analyzing, okay, well, let's assume that maybe there are multiple intelligences, and then kind of go from there, and then we'll call them something else, and then we'll kind of like throw them into the general overall school of, well, I don't know, what should we call it, assessment tests, and then maybe we can average the averages and average all the test averages and still try to come to this unifying but unclear one we call intelligence. Boy, I have so many notes. Okay, so with that, let's go to the reading now. While I'm looking for that, I'll play a little bit more of that video.
There is a very broad gap between the average person, the incredibly incompetent, and the especially competent. This is why hierarchies matter. So since the alt-right has expanded rapidly, we have had an influx of what are typically called normies. And you see a problem when these people become attached to Nazi symbols, and when they start to talk about proper long-term objectives for the movement. You should stay within the kinds of activities which are feasible for your segment of the cognitive spectrum. But you can't just tell people to do that, because perhaps the IQ 100 person, the average person, will understand that basic rationale and say, I should leave the strategy up to the people who are fit to the task. But the people who are 1 or 2 standard deviations below the mean, and that's a huge segment of the population, and that segment is included in the quote-unquote normies. Those people will not necessarily understand that rationale, and they will not necessarily obey it.
Okay, now, and I like this, right? Because Because, yeah, I mean, Eric, it's interesting. He'll talk about assessments generally. He's an open mind. He's very, very bright. This video, once again, is called The Normie Question. I'll try to drop a link to everything I'm referencing and drop a bunch of my quotes too. It's a 7-minute video, but it's interesting because now he's trying to talk about nations within the right, after this whole Charlottesville shit that's gone on. Not that anybody was denying variance. If you claim the idea of a unitary scoring of IQ, right? If you're claiming to that, then he's bringing up the argument of first the assessment of the APVAP, which is like a radical, like the radical view that I'll be reading now, and then he tries to scale it in terms of hierarchy and different populations, which in a way is kind of the critique against, not against the bell curve proper, but once again, it's a political strategy. So if you read the bell curve, if you even read the back cover of the bell curve, and I'll drop the PDFs for the mismeasure of man, I'll drop the PDF for the bell curve in the comments, right? If you look at all this, right? If you look at all this, you'll see that it's really about how to plan a society. But okay, so anyway, I don't want to carry on and pontificate because I have a couple other things that I'm trying to get to here. And boy, I thought I had that tab open. Okay, so here we go. This is the radicals, the theory of multiple intelligence from the bell curve. This is starts on page 18. And so here we go. Lippmann's hostility towards intelligence testing was grounded in his belief that this most important of all human qualities was too diverse, too complex, too changeable, too dependent on cultural context, and above all, too subjective to be measured by answers to a mere list of test questions. Intelligence seemed to him, as it does to many other thoughtful people who are not themselves expert in testing, more like beauty or justice than height or weight. Before something that can be measured, it must be defined. This argument goes, right? So I just, keep that in mind, that testing intelligence, this guy is saying all these things are more subjective. It's not measurable. It's more like testing beauty or aesthetics and justice, the concept, right, as opposed to height and weight. Before anything that can be measured and defined, his argument goes, and the problems of definition for beauty and justice or intelligence are insuperable. To people who hold these views, the claims of the intelligence testers seems naive at best and vicious at worst. These views, which are generally advanced primarily by non-specialists, have found an influential spokesman from the Academy, which is mainly why we include them here. We refer here to the theory of multiple intelligences formulated by Howard Gardner, a Harvard psychologist. Gardner's general definition of intelligent behavior does not seem radical at all. For Gardner, as for many other thinkers on intelligence, the notion of problem solving is central. A human intellectual competence must entail a set of skills of problem solving, he writes, enabling the individual to resolve genuine problems or difficulties that he or she encounters and, when appropriate, to create an effective product, and also must entail the potential for finding or creating problems, thereby laying the groundwork for the acquisition of new knowledge. Gardner's view, right, and so that's Gardner, I just quoted, within the bell curve, which they're quoting Gardner. Okay, so anyway, Gardner's view is radical. A word he used, Gardner's view is radical, a word he uses himself to describe his theory, in that he rejects virtually without qualification, that's their one slam against, without qualification, the notice of general intelligence factor, which is to say that he denies G. Instead, he argues, so I'm just going to stop there. He denies G. Gould says there is no G, right? But both of them are in type denial. Anyway, let me carry on. Instead, he argues the case for 7 distinct intelligences: linguistic, musical, logical-mathematical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, and 2 forms of personal intelligence, the intrapersonal and the interpersonal, each based on its own unique computational capacity, right? Not unlike the ADVAB test, general assessments, right? So it's already a multiplicity and not a unity, right? It's radical because it's pluralized, the intelligence assessments. Okay, so each based on its own unique computational capacity. Gardner rejects the criticism that he has merely redefined the word intelligence by broadening it to include what many more properly be called talents. And then they quote him saying, "I place no particular premium on the word intelligence." I love that. I place no particular premium on the word intelligence, but I do place great importance on the equivalence of various human faculties, he writes. If critics of his theory were willing to label language and logical thinking as talents as well, and to remove these from the pedestal they currently occupy, then I would be happy to speak of multiple talents, quote unquote, Gardner. Okay, so here we go. Gardner's approach is also radical in that it does not defend his theory with quantitative data. He draws on findings from anthropology to zoology in his narrative, but in a field that has been intensely quantitative since its inception. Gardner's work is uniquely devoid of psychometric or quantitative evidence, right? And then he dismisses factor analysis. Given the same set of data, it is possible using so okay, wait, let me start this part over. He dismisses factor analysis. Given the same set of data, it is possible using one set of factor analytic procedures to come up with a picture that supports the idea of a G factor. Using another equally valid method of statistical analysis, it is possible to support the notion of a family of relatively discrete mental abilities. Okay, so, and then back to Hernstein and Murray. He is untroubled by the fact that the tests of varying intelligence in his theory seem to be intercorrelated, quote unquote. I fear that I cannot accept these correlations at face value. Nearly all current tests are so devised that they call principally upon linguistic and logical faculty. Accordingly, individuals with these skills are likely to do well even in tests of musical or spatial abilities, while those who are not especially facile linguistically and logically are likely to be impaled by such standardized tests. And see, and that's really interesting there, right? Is because basically he's saying if there are these multiple tests, kind of like the ADVAP that's used as an assessment, right? And somebody, that this basically saying so much more is put on linguistics and logical capability than on spatial or musical or these interpersonal abilities. Okay, so anyway, back here. So in general, he invites his readers to disregard the thorny complexities of classical and revisionist approaches when it comes to the, right, quote unquote, hey kitty. When it comes to the interpretation of intelligence testing, we are faced with an issue of taste or preference rather than on one which scientific closure is likely to be reached. Okay. And so we're gonna read a little bit more, and now we're in the portion of the introduction of the bell curve that is the perspective of this book. The perspective of this book, right? Given these different ways of understanding intelligence, you will naturally ask where our sympathies lie and how they shape this book. Most heavily from the classical tradition. That body of scholarship represents an immense and rigorous analyzed body of knowledge by accepted standards of what constitutes scientific evidence and scientific proof. The classical tradition has, in our view, I'm glad they said in our view, given the world a treasure of information that is largely ignored in trying to understand contemporary policy issues. Huh? Right? So the point about relegating the bell curve to generate these averages in populations, right? Which is so peculiar because, because they're, they'll even go on to say, look, we're not going to say anything about the individual. You can't. But in any measured population, we can average it out. A cognitive coefficient, right? We can measure it out, even though Stephen Jay Gould kind of pretty much debunked the variability of their metric. So moreover, because our topic is the relationship of human abilities to public policy, we will be dealing in relationships that are based on an aggregate data, which is where the classical tradition has most to offer. Perhaps an example, we will illustrate what we mean. So they measure individuals, and then they measure the individual relative to a population. And then so relative to some X population, right? I'm not going to say it's arbitrary. Anyone that's within this group, we will measure you individually. We will make multiple assessments, and then we're going to average this. Then that will tell us where you score A relative to that population. Right? I'm not saying it's problematic just in understanding what it is they're doing, because it is so interesting that scores are given to individuals, unified singular axiomatic scores of intelligence are given to individuals, but really that score is only relative to what are considered particular population relationships, right? And so to what extent is the world measured? What really is an average, and who really, well, of all the people tested, what can be said, and in what manner are they tested, right? So it's as if the variability of what the population is as a discrete unit, right, an inclusive discrete outline of X population, right, they're still going to point to individuals and give them a score, but the whole point is about the population. Okay, so anyway, the question at issue, and that they go into that here. Suppose that the question is at issue regards individuals. Given two 11-year-olds, one with an IQ of 110 and one with an IQ of 90, we can, what can you tell us about the differences between these two children? Question mark. The answer must be phrased very tentatively. On many important topics, the answer must be, we can tell you nothing with any confidence. Okay, so like Stefan, right, he'll say, oh, those sub-Saharan Africans have an average IQ of 70, and American Africans on average have an IQ of 85, so there's a 15-point deviation, and he says, and this is because of the mixed European blood in the American black populated. So that's the justification. And then here, these guys, all from 90 to 110, right? Here's the authors, once again, of the bell curve themselves speaking, right, of a 20-point deviation. And here they are saying, what can you tell us about the differences between these two children? The answer must be phrased very tentatively. On many important topics, the answer must be, we can tell you nothing with any confidence. That's right. So here we have Stefan Molyneux pontificating about what is capable or not capable of a population that cannot come up with capitalism and the virtues of Westernism and colonialism and blah, 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 all the bullshit that he touts, right? And and talking about welfare in other countries and whether or not, well, I don't know whether or not he's read or seen the video on Guns, Germs, and Steel, talking about the movement and migration of technologies in the Europes, right? I don't know if Stefan buys into that, or even what some of his more nuanced thinkings are. Like I said, he's really just harps on intelligence, right? And here he harps on a difference between 70 and 85, right? But then and then says, well, and people in Detroit, right? They can't put it together. But that's 85 to 100. 100, boy, that being the European mean, well, that's where colonialism can come in. Even though good old Eric Orwell will talk about being assessed not in IQ proper, but around 4 deviations higher or at 140, and basically saying all these average Joes that made colonial, they're good for average labor. We need hierarchies. Anyway, and I can't overemphasize the point of how these authors phrase that. Okay, and then they continue on. Even though say we can tell you nothing with any confidence, by the authors themselves saying that. And so hopefully you got my point. Over here, Stefan's using a what I think is a lower margin, and he's talking about everything that can't be done and the deficits. And then here's the authors of the book he touts, talking of a greater margin and saying we can't tell you anything with confidence, right, about these two individuals that are scoring within a population of a deviation from 90 to 110. Okay, it is well worth a guidance counselor's time to know what these individual scores are, but only in combination with a variety of other information about the child's personality, talents, and background. The individual's IQ score, all by itself, is a useful tool, but a limited one. Now, the authors here, right, they're not quoting anybody. They're speaking this. This is their words, right? This is their words. You big dumb shit. You want to know the facts, and you want an argument. Stefan Molyneux wants an argument, and he wants to know the facts, and he wants to talk about IQ, and he's going to refer to this very impeccable, very blah, blah, blah book from the 90s. Shit. And the authors themselves are more liberal in even their approach to this. About a whole approach to let's unify it, let's take the structural approach, let's apply it to general population so we can talk about general things in the population, right? So my point is that even the authors are more forgivable than the abuse that they're warning us about that Stefan emulates, right? That a lot of the moderns that are stigmatized to some conviction about IQ in this fashion, right? In this singular numeric, immutable, like they say, immutable scoring that somehow measures all the attributes, capabilities, and it's a great forecaster, and just all of this touting. It's almost as if the school of IQ and the beliefs and the convictions about it misunderstood by these pontificating, self-centered, egomaniac, uppity fuckers like Stefan, right, that have a high audience, that have got these, I don't know, people to follow him. God, I want to wring his neck. I want to wring his fucking neck. And no wonder I'm making this video, because I just get tired of fucking Stefan. Stefan, you're a dumb piece of shit. You're a smart dumb guy, right? You're a dumb smart guy. Suppose instead the question at issue, given 2 6th grade classes, one for which the IQ is 110, and for the other, which the IQ is 90, what can you tell us about the difference between those two classes and their average prospects for the future? Now, there is a great deal to be said, and it can be said with considerable confidence, not about any one person in either class, but about average outcomes that are important to school to educational policy in general, and to society writ large, right? So once again, to school and education. So the relegation, once again, it's within academia. It's started with academic performance. The other tests are about military performance. This adherence to being able to abide by instruction, right? That really seems to be the background, the backbone of what this is what do you want to adhere to? And oh, you'll hear Stefan, oh, well, you know, if you have ethics and you maintain ethics and you're relegating of your ethics, then you can belong to a society as amazing as ours, right? And yet, oh, well, we have the free market and schooling's all bad. And yet the irony is that this is about schooling. It's about the education. So it's almost as if school gets criticized as a leftist academic thing that's pointing back to itself and it's ignoring these philosophies. And yet what they're using it for stems itself from tests that are measuring the inner workings of academia. Okay. Anyway. Okay. So you guys can read, you guys can read the book. You guys can even look at it from whatever bias or standpoint you want, right? You'll get a bunch of jagoffs that'll read it. I think they're not reading it well. I don't think they're being accurate. I don't think they're giving their sympathies over to what their convictions, what the convictions they're bringing to the read are already. Right? I think they're stuck to their own convictions and they're only trying to cherry pick out of it these things instead of actually giving it a meat, right? Asking, where could I be wrong in this? What do I have to read that kind of emphasizes how it is my position may be wrong? Let me grand over a little bit of this argument here and a little bit of this argument here. Okay. With all of that being said, I think the last portion of this video is my theory, right, that even on reading about intelligence tests and the bell curve and having, this general criticism, first of all, about theories of intelligence, right? Since I studied linguistics and structure theory, Saussure and Derrida and the deconstructionists and all the other bullshit that fucking Jordan Peterson, Stefan's new cohort, looking, trying to defame and scapegoat Derrida, right? And there's videos that already show this. But if you get into the meat, I mean, even the philosophers, some of the best professors that describe overall what Derrida is doing in terms of structure within linguistics, they're very good at this. There's nothing quite like reading Derrida. There's nothing quite like reading in depth of grammatology, I think. But even that, Derrida admits that his work could be deconstructed. And part of my notions stem of what would it mean to take a little bit about what I know about linguistics and see if I can do an overlay that might apply to kind of like a third part, like neutral monism between the idea between cultural, okay, first of all, how to do this. How to take all three of these brands, the classicist, the revisionist, as information processing. The classicist is unifying, the revisionist as at least one difference in a information processing, and the radical, who speaks of multiple talents, relationships, and an absence of a general singular score, right? And so let's take that and let's find an intersection or assume that we can conflate those three together, right? Like a Venn diagram, and put those three together and assume that there's some intersectionality that's, it's contradictory kind of on its face. But let's apply some of these reasons why is it that Stefan will argue that Eastern Orientals and you have a higher IQ and score better, and have these admissions different than Caucasians. And then let's and how Caucasians are scoring better, supposedly, um, in these assessments, and, as opposed to black folk, right? Before I do that, I wanted to talk about physiological differences, right? Let's suppose, first of all, that my orientation to this very computer, let's say I drink a lot of coffee and I'm all jittery, duh, my metabolism's kind of weird, right? I'm tall, I have to arc over, the computers at the testing, they're lower, I have to like squat my neck forward, right, to look where a shorter dude can like, I can look at the screen straight on, right? So maybe my stature as a taller guy is different, but that's not my argument, not even, but so first what I'm going to do is I'm going to caveat the idea of metabolism, right? I'm going to suggest that Oriental folks are trained or maybe have a lower physiological metabolism, and that they are able, through a history of meditations and movements that, let's say, are slower and more paced. It's less hunter-gatherer and it's more agricultural, and that they have meditation and Buddhism, and that their genetics have grown up in a way where perhaps their actually bodily metabolism is slower. Caucasians have a little bit higher metabolism, but not as high of a metabolism as hunter-gatherers, like the Africans, right? Africans have let's say, they have a higher metabolism, right? So let's say that we're going to speak of genetics, and we're going to talk about this idea of metabolism as a factor, right? And let's say that perhaps attentiveness, right, the ability to work with a slower metabolism actually has something to do with how these groups score different on the tests, right? So there's that. Then let's bring up a little bit more about the cultural aspect. Let's say, well, Oriental people, they sit, let's say, kind of like Native Americans, right, which come supposedly from the Orient over that, meaning that the Native Americans have, their part of their indigenous bloodline is of the Asian continent, right? And that they like to sit in teepees, or in Asia they like to sit in circles and contemplate, or the idea of temples, that type of thing, right? And perhaps even the idea of the study methodology is more communal, it's more group oriented, right? Let's say that that um, that Caucasians isn't so much group, council, roundtable oriented. It's more gang oriented. It's like clumps of people with more of a menagerie, right? So they might talk, and they might work in groups, and they might work alone, right? And then let's talk about hunter gatherers who, or the actually those hunting, right? And how they work more in sparse populations around a specific topic, but don't work necessarily individually. And they do work in gangs, but they work in more sparse gangs. So they don't communicate as a close group, right? They might do it prior to the hunt and after the hunt, but they don't do it during the hunt, right? Not to say that Asians don't hunt, not to say that Caucasians don't hunt. I'm not saying that. We're making these weird generalizations, right? So there's that, right? I'll just throw that out. But now my theory, and this is something I haven't found, right, as far as the application of let's say, one's genetics over time relative to the structure of the grapheme, or the structure of the form of their language itself, right? Okay, because like in what we read here, some of I think it was Gardner, right? His criticism was that the logical and spatial, or the logical and linguistic aspects of the tests predominate over the musical and the linguistics, right? In certain variabilities. So what I want to suggest, and what I'm kind of working on with a paper of this, to some extent, not that I'm going to source that highly like a general academic would, but I'll write on it, right, is this. And granted, okay, so here's the difference, not between sub-Saharan African and black Americans, right? That Stefan will claim, well, they're part. The Africans are mostly mixed with some European blood, where the sub-Saharan Africans are black, right? I will propose the variables that sub-Saharan folks not coming from a written history, particularly, I'm not, how do I break this down? They're more phonological and less graphomatic, right? Their graphology is basically non-occurring, right? The Bantu languages, the click languages, the phonology is not about a relationship between the graphemine and the phoneme. It's just the phoneme. The black culture, the black genetics, let's say, arose mostly around the phoneme. One might even argue, I think Derrida even might suggest, well, black people will hit nouns harder than the Europeans will stumble over their consonants, right? So here's the idea, though, right? Is that because you have a population, a genetic population, their orientation to their very linguistics, how it is the population arises and speaks and understands one another from sub-Saharan Africa, is mostly phonological, meaning audio, meaning sound, meaning this, verbal, as a linguist from the tongue, right? As opposed to language, which covers graphemes and phonemes and logos, and signs and structures and all sorts of other goodies, right? And wind language in terms of structure, right? And so, assuming that there is a genetic component that factors in somehow, it's almost where culture and genetics mix. It's found within one's orientation to the history of how their genetics arose relative to the population's orientation to a language. So if you say the orientation to one's language from sub-Saharan African is mostly phonologic instead of graphologic, right? Then you can suppose that the black people today might be more about just speeching with a less attentiveness towards the written word, to the grapheme, meaning they have a natural or physiological inclination to speak as opposed to read, right? They're not there to pick up signs to the signified, let's say the Caucasian might, and so they're relegated to a preference for phonologism as opposed to the grapheme, right? So as opposed to the read. And that this isn't, these are huge generalizations, right? I'm just waxing theoretical. But who isn't? I mean, really, come on, what are we convicted to? Okay, so here's the next stage, right? The Caucasian, the Indo-European speaker, left to right read, right? But we came out of a long history of illiteracy where there's only really people reading, right? But as far as when literacy picked up and the reading of symbols, it was generally a linear left to right read, and then it was a plowman, right? It was left to right and right to left, and there were no gaps between the words. It was just a full read, and if you don't believe me, you can look this up, right? But it's called the plowman's read, right? But the thing is, it's linear left to right, and the words then were gapped eventually, and they were gapped. A word is gapped phonologically, right? Meaning that the grapheme, the word itself, the text itself, is graphed on how an alphabet defines an entirety of a word, right? So the grapheme, one word segmented off of the next, just like you normally would read now, right, in a text, right? Each word has a phonological relationship that is spoken, right? But it is reduced to a left to right read with gaps where each grapheme word is grouped this way. Not every letter, right? Every letter has an a, be, de, ba, but the grammatical structure shows the exceptions of, well, we're going to leave that noun silent and we're going to pronounce this consonant more, and everything that is composed within English and Spanish and the Germanic languages and so forth, right? So anyway, so my point though is this. So there's a narrowing left to right read of the Indo-European language from graphemine and its relationship to the phoneme that the genetic population of the Caucasian move through, right? So they have that, right? And so there is their attentiveness to test taking, where a lot of the tests are also about the read, right? They might have a predominance over the black folk who are maybe more relegated to the phonology. Okay, right. But now let's talk about the Oriental structure, like the Chinese, right? So the Chinese, they're kind of like our alphabet can produce an infinity of words, right? And we say, oh, well, Mandarin has 300 and whatever characters in their alphabet, right? But really it's not, it's more pictographic, right? And it's their ideographs. Ideograms. So they're ideographs. So what we have here, right, is I'm going to speculate, right? But I think the East adapted more to the West than the West. The Oriental adapted more to the Occidental than the Occidental did to the Oriental. But the Oriental by itself, right, they have ideograms, and they have phonological relationships to these pictographic words that are not, like, each word does not have a phonologic relationship. Like if you're reading algebra, right? An ideogram, just Google it, an ideogram, like algebra or like math, right? You don't see a math equation and have, you say a squared over b squared equals c squared, right? You're still pronouncing everything, but you're not going parenthetical a minus b, left parenthetical underscore division line a minus b, right? You read algebra and you understand algebra without a phonological relationship, right? You're looking at it as a group of relational aspects that by itself have no phonologic relationship, right? So that's what an ideogram is. Now, so the Oriental people, they have words that do have phonological relationships. They have, specific words that do have this, and they have these ideograms embedded within their graphic text, right? And granted, Japanese is not the same as Mandarin, and modern Korean, it's a synthesized language, right? Each of their letters necessarily has a phonic thing without revision. You don't have spelling bees in Korean, right? Because it's an exact relationship. I mean, the graph, there is no graphic interplay or interference like Western. Generalizing mostly to Chinese because their history splinters off into the Japanese and into the other subsect of languages that stem through the Orient. But nevertheless, do they have this multiplicity of single pictographs that they're reading up, down to up to down, left to right, but they have also, in intersecting the West, have over centuries, right, have adopted a left to right read. They've also adopted the mathematics set forth. Shit, I think they're even on our same calendar. Go figure. Go figure how the West has taken this over. So not only do they have ideograms, they're raised with ideograms, non-phylologic relationships. They're also capable of reading up and down, left to right, and they also know the phonological structure within their historic language and a left to right read, right? A left to right read, just like, so they've adopted all of that. So they already are raised culturally and maybe physiologically, they may be more adept, right, to having a greater understanding of different linguistic and thinking type of patterns innately because of their relationship and their orientation to their own language. And hence they score higher on certain things because they all out of the gate know a greater possibility of interpretation than the rigorous structures that just a simple left to right Caucasian read might have, and the left to right read might by itself by having grapheme and phonologic relationships supersede the the phonologic centrism, the phonology singularly of the sub-Saharan. This is it's interesting because I don't want to call it cultural, but I don't not want to call it cultural. It's not cultural. It maybe is not genetic, right? This is what I mean by there's some sort of Venn diagrammic, almost contrary intersection where this theory, my little theory here, of one's orientation to language and their history and their genetics yield these IQ differences. So, okay, that's a competing theory for you, Stefan Molyneux, to stuff in your ear hole, your pie hole, your eye hole, your pupil holes, and non for a tad, you uncreative, unthinking, reiterative, right wing, harping on this and that, trying to make yourself superior, capitalistic, free market, binary, right wing, yada, Yahoo. Anyway, thanks. I encourage everyone to read more Mismeasure of Man's. If you're on the right, read Mismeasure of Man. And if you're on the right or left, read the Bell Curve. And if you're just creative and you're all over the map, then listen to my theory and just read more speculative theories that even these guys know. And even the caveats and Stefan's like, you're like, well, I don't know everything, but I'm going to say this. And then he kind of caveats it, but then he'll drop, when the shoe drops, he'll land something as the fact on it and then get people to just stick to shit. Like he is fucking religion more than the irony of him being an atheist about religions. The guy is full of ironic hypocrisies, all about truth and virtue and this and that and singularity. But it's all this really, guys. There's more in heaven and earth, the ratio than you could possibly imagine, or however I misquoted. Okay, well, anyway, thanks for listening. Feel free to leave a comment in the bottom, and I'll probably I'll start linking. If they're not there immediately, forgive me. You might have to give me 24 hours. It's past my bedtime. Have a good night. And don't donate to Free Domain Radio. Donate to whomever you want. And in last words,